So let's go into this third series. So where did these races come from? Why do we look so different? And I see just in this room we have representatives of these so-called different races. Well, what is the definition of a race, first of all? And this is what I found in one of my dictionaries at home. Okay, it's a group of people who are identified as distinct from other groups because of supposed physical or genetic traits shared by the group. Or another way of saying it is the division of mankind according to these physical characteristics. And traditionally, until fairly recently, it's been taught that the different races that we have on this earth have evolved separately or independently in different parts of the earth, and that some races are more evolved than others. And here is the classical classification of the human races. So we would have, starting from some kind of evolutionary ancestor, we have the independent evolution of the Australoid, the Negroids, the Mongoloids, and the Caucasoids. And the length of this arrow would be a representation of how far evolved they are, how advanced they are. But it's kind of interesting that the longest arrow is the Caucasoids, and who proposed this theory? It was the Caucasoids. So this has been the traditional or historical way of viewing the so-called races. Very much also promoted by Darwin and some of his thinking, and a particular book that he wrote after on the origin of species called The Descent of Man. It's quite shocking actually, some of the things that are written in that book, but we won't go into those details now. So I'd like to present to you a very interesting study. In 1988, Newsweek magazine, who are known worldwide, and they report on news. And in this particular issue, in January 1988, they reported on some research that they performed, and they called it the search for Adam and Eve. Not because they were creationists or believed in the Bible, just because people think of Adam and Eve as this mythical start of life, start of mankind kind of idea, without necessarily believing in the biblical Adam and Eve. So in this research they performed, we read that scientists took the placenta from 147 women from all over the world, representing all the different human populations, and they studied this placenta. Now why? Because they wanted to study the mitochondrial DNA. Now we have two types of DNA. The more classical that everyone hears about and thinks about is the nuclear DNA. Then you've got the second type of DNA found in the mitochondria. The mitochondria is like the powerhouses, the power factory of our cells. Now this mitochondrial DNA passes intact only from mother to daughter. It passes to the son, but then doesn't get transmitted further. So it only goes from mother to daughter along the maternal line. So to be able to study, to find out what is our origin as a human race, if we took the DNA, we know that the DNA that we have is a mix of the DNA from our two parents. And our parent DNA is a mix of their parents, who is a mix of their parents, and so on. So you can see that we are the mix of all of our ancestors all put together. So it becomes very difficult to understand and follow certain progression in the mutations of the DNA. Instead, if we take the mitochondrial DNA, we can have a much purer line to see if they could go back to find if there was an origin of mankind, or in this case, womankind. And they came to some very unusual, very surprising conclusions based on the historical perception of the races. They concluded that there was a surprisingly elevated similarity amongst all the women from every race. And they also concluded that modern man did not evolve separately in different parts of the world, but that we all descend from a single woman from somewhere in Africa. This was the very surprising conclusion of this research. And in this research, based on the mutation rate, because there were some differences, so assuming you start with a first modern woman, with some mutations, you can then explain all the differences that we then find. And based on the number of mutations, they assumed, or they estimated, that Eve lived between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago. But remember those glasses I talked about in the first evening? Those glasses that are tinted by our assumptions, by our preconceived ideas. So putting on their evolutionary glasses, they said, well, the data says between 100,000 and 200,000, but we know that man evolved longer ago than that. Man evolved hundreds of thousands of years ago. So let's say it's more likely to be closer to 200, not 100,000. And the article reads, however, this finding carries a profound message of biological brotherhood. So instead of being separate races that evolved independently, we are all biological brothers. We're cousins, all of us. And this was quite a striking result, quite a striking conclusion. But this age of 200,000 years was strange. It is too recent. A man evolved earlier than that, according to the preconceptions. So they said, we need to continue to study this further. We need to do some more research. Well, 10 years later, another article was published, this time in Science magazine, a very well-known evolutionary magazine. It was published in January 1998. And in this article, we can read, introducing new forensic procedures, mitochondrial DNA appears to mutate faster than expected, raising worrying questions about the dating of evolutionary events. With respect to the causes, evolutionists are increasingly worried about the effects of a faster mutation rate. Remember, before they calculated that Eve probably lived between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago, but they assumed there must be 200,000 or more. Well, they suddenly found another big surprise, that because the mitochondrial DNA mutates even faster, it means that using this new clock, this new genetic clock, mitochondrial Eve would be only 6,000 years old. So the journalist who wrote this article, who's not a scientist, okay, she specializes in the subject of paleontology, etc. So she had some kind of scientific understanding. But this scientist puts on her evolutionary glasses and writes in this article, no one thinks that this is the case. Let us think about this. So a journalist, a reporter, is basically saying that everybody knows that this answer is wrong. So this means the scientists have spent the last 10 years of their lives, they have spent who knows how many millions of dollars arriving at a conclusion that everybody knows is wrong. This is how powerful the glasses that we wear, our preconceived ideas can be in the way we look at everything in the world. But this age of thousands of years is perfectly compatible with the creation model. In the first night we talked about the fact that both evolution and creationism are not scientific theories because they do not respect the simple criteria for scientific theories. So I prefer talking about models because no one was present to observe either of them happening. So they're models. So the biblical model, I would say, fits perfectly with the result of this scientific study. Staying on the subject of genetics, when we study the Y chromosome of all the men on the entire Earth, we find that there's an incredible similarity in the Y chromosome of the men. So if we look at the biblical position, so the creationist model, we know that it talks about this worldwide flood. In this worldwide flood, who are the people that went on the ark? Well, we had Noah, his wife, their 3 sons, and the 3 wives of the sons of Noah, the daughters-in-law. So from a Y chromosome perspective, Noah had his Y chromosome. his 3 sons would definitely have inherited the same Y chromosome as their father. And they are the only ancestors for the populations that we have. So we can explain the fact that the Y chromosome is similar in all the world very well by the creation model. The other thing that we find, and by the way, they wanted to study the Y chromosome and compare the Y chromosome between a chimpanzee and a human. And they predicted, based on their evolution glasses, that they would be similar, and they were surprised to find that they were very different. The other thing, when we study the mitochondrial DNA of all these ladies around the world, we can essentially classify them into 3 primary groups. They are called the M line, the N line, and the R line. So let's analyze the creation model. On this ark, the Bible doesn't tell us that Noah and his wife had additional children after they came onto the ark. So we have to assume that they didn't. So who are the 3 women? The wives of the sons, and most likely the 3 wives of the 3 sons probably came from different families. And this could explain, since all the women, modern women, descend from these 3 ladies, this can explain why we might have the 3 primary mitochondrial DNA lines. There are different theories going around about how human beings came to populate the Earth. The dominant one of these is the out of Africa model, so that modern man came somewhere out of North Africa, according to this map, based by studying the different variations in the genetics of the different populations. Well, according to the biblical creation model, Noah's Ark landed after the total destruction of the earth by flood, landed on the mountains of Ararat. The mountains of Ararat are in Mesopotamia, was Mesopotamia, so very close to the northern part of Africa. So again, this seems to line up with what the evolutionary scientists are describing about genetics. And also, they have proposed that in our history, there has been a bottleneck. The bottleneck is basically a narrowing. Imagine like the neck of a bottle. Imagine you have 1,000 people running along the street, and they all want to come inside this room through that door. And they have to try and squeeze past, and they can only go through very slowly. That's the idea of a bottleneck. And so, by studying genes, the evolutionary scientists have said that at some point, mankind, the species of man, nearly went extinct to very few individuals, and then was able to recover to the billions of people we now have. Well, again, going back to the creation model, on the ark, we went from millions of people living before Noah's global flood to only 8 people. And then all the populations that now exist descend from those 8 people. So once more, the creation model holds up very well to the data that has been presented by science. So going back to these races, what is the difference between the races? So I would like to propose that the difference between the races is 0 to %. What does this mean? Well, I'm talking about genetics. The difference between any 2 individuals on this planet is only 0.2% of our genome. These are the differences that give us different skin colors, different height, different color hair, different color eyes, different shaped nose, tall, short, stocky, thin. All these genes are only part of 0.2% of our total genetic makeup. This corresponds to 3 billion base pairs, so 6 billion genes. This means that 6 million are different. And we can further break down this 0.2 difference. Only 6% of this 0.2% are unique genetic differences that exist only between 2 different races. Within any local population or ethnic group, we can have up to 85% of the total variation. Because in any small local population or ethnic group, we see big differences between individuals. And so what uniquely defines one person from one race from another person, another race, is essentially 0.012% of the DNA. So this essentially means that the conclusion is the races genetically don't exist. There is a single human race genetically. And this is a good news, because it means that the blood that runs underneath our skin is the same. It means we can donate blood and receive blood from any person on this planet as long as we have the right blood group. So science, modern science, has only recently discovered that the races don't exist. That there is one human race. Both from this genetic perspective, from mitochondrial Eve studies, and from various studies. But what has been the biblical or the creationist perspective all this time? That there has always been only one human race. In fact, if you look at Acts chapter 7, this book in the Bible, verse 26, we can read, "And he has made all nations of men of one blood to dwell on all the face of the earth." And so from a creationist model, we are all brothers and sisters on this planet. There is no difference between us. Okay, but hang on a minute. When you said there are no differences between us, there are. Look in this room. We can see people who all look very different. And I will use skin color in this presentation just to highlight a visual difference between them. So we can have the very white, and I'm a classical example of the very white. My mother is Swedish. And I've taken more after my mother. My father's Italian, but northern Italian. So he's tall, he was blonde and blue-eyed. But I've taken more after my mother. So this is me. And then we can have the other extreme, which we, for simplicity, will call black. And we have people here who are much darker color than me. Okay? So, but we're very different. No, we're not. We have the same skin color. We all have the same skin color. And it's called melanin. The pigment melanin is the same for everyone on this planet. Simply, we produce different quantities of this melanin. Melanin is made up of two substances. Eumelanin, which is a dark brown. This is what gives us our tan. We get darker in the sun. All the races, or should I call them now people groups, because races do not exist anymore, get darker when they spend more time in the sun. And pheomelanin, which is a reddish color. So when you have different combinations or different concentrations of these two substances, melanin, we then define the color of our skin. So we can have from no melanin, which is albino. I lived for a number of years as a child in Africa, and every now and then you would see an albino. It's quite unusual to see the afro features, but skin whiter than mine. Albino we can find both in the human species and in the animal species. We can have albino rabbits, albino tigers, albino pretty much everything. And it's a genetic defect. It's a mutation. It's an error. So somehow the factory that produces melanin, the switch to turn on the melanin, has stopped working. And quite often, people who are albinos have other health issues. Then we have the little production of little melanin, white, so that would be me. And then we have a whole series or group of people, like from the Chinese, Indian, for example, the Eskimos, who have kind of red, yellow, browny kind of skin. And then we have the other extreme, which we call black, which is the production of a lot of melanin. It can easily be explained by genetics. So the production of melanin is determined by our genes. What is the function of melanin? Melanin protects us from the harmful rays of the sun, ultraviolet rays. So we tend to find that the populations that live in the very hot climates where there is a lot of sun exposure have darker skin. And the populations that live in the places like Scandinavia that have a lot less sunshine, and in the winter they have almost no sunshine, tend to have much lighter skin. And as I will explain a little bit later, this is a function of natural selection. So we have the genetically defined potential to produce only a certain amount of melanin. I could never produce large quantities of melanin, even if I spent all day in the sun. I'd like to present to you a very interesting picture. Now, unfortunately, it's a little bit dark here in this, with this projector, but this is a very distinguished and striking young lady. And we notice immediately there's some quite unusual features. One feature would be these scars. And we might think, oh, poor lady, did she fall against the glass or something in the window? Well, no, these are the signs of a distinguished lady in this culture. Why, you ladies don't have scars? You don't beautify yourself? Oh, you look ugly. Again, it depends on the glasses that we are wearing. What else can we notice? This lady smokes a pipe. Wow, this is unusual. What, you ladies don't smoke pipes? What's wrong with you? Okay, it's what glasses are we wearing? And the other thing we notice is, whoa, where are my sunglasses? These are nice teeth. I wish I had teeth like this. I had penicillin as a child, and so when my permanent teeth grew, they're kind of yellowish, they're pretty horrible. And I can bet you anything that she has probably never stepped foot in a dentist's studio or gone to the pharmacy to buy those tapes that they stick to your teeth to get whitening treatment or laser treatment or anything. Just beautiful teeth. But these features, in my opinion, aren't the most striking feature. What's the most striking feature? Eyes. Her eyes. Wow, she's got Chinese eyes. I get it. Her father was Chinese. No. Her grandfather was Chinese. No. Not even the postman was Chinese. Because this is a lady, very unique lady, from a very unique tribe called the Mondari tribe, who live in a very remote part of the south of Sudan. Now, remote is the key word here. As we talked about in the first evening, when we have a small population that is isolated from a much larger parent population, then we start having the effects of natural selection. And the population starts losing some of the genetic information of the parent population and becoming more specialized, more limited in their genetic information, just like all the dog breeds that we have now. They descend all from a kind of wolf breed, but then you have the Chihuahua and the Great Dane and everything, but they're very specialized. They have lost genetic information to the point where all these pure breed dogs have serious issues, hip dysplasia, and all sorts of other problems because their genome is very poor. So this lady represents a group of people who have lost the genetic information to have a caucasoid eye like mine. So how does this eye thing work? Well, it's quite simple to explain. It's again controlled genetically. And the only difference between the Caucasian eye and the Asian eye is the fat that's deposited around the eye, because the eyeball itself, what's underneath, is the same for both. And so the Chinese eye, the Asian almond eye, tends to have more fat deposited around the skin, which gives a different shape to the face, to the eye. And this is controlled genetically. Now we know that the DNA in our bodies, in our cells, is like a blueprint, it's a construction plan. It defines the fact that we are going to develop into human beings and not earthworms. It's what defines that we will have green eyes or blue eyes or brown eyes. It defines whether we're going to have curly hair or no hair, as in my case. So the DNA, we know, is fundamental for our development and for who we are. And we know that we inherit half the DNA from our mother and half the DNA from our father. And when these combine in the fertilized egg, we have once more the complete information necessary to produce a new human being. But what if one of these is black and the other is white? It doesn't matter which way around. Then the results become very interesting. And the result is mulatto, the term that we use. Now, when we have mulatto, it's very interesting because we can have a lot of surprising effects. This is a picture of a photo that appeared in an English newspaper in February 2006. These are twin girls. These are the same twin girls as they're starting to grow up, more recently in 2014. These are the Aylmar twins, born in 1997. One has much clearer, dark curly hair, much darker skin. The other is white with red hair. Here we have the single twins born in Australia in 2006. One is white, one is black. How come? Well, if we look at this case, where we've got a picture also of the parents, we look at the parents, and the parents are mulatto. In England, after the war, there was a lack of men to work, to rebuild the economy. So they invited men to come over, or families to come over for some of their colonies. And we had many West Indians come over and live in England. And so these West Indian origin people started to marry the locals, the local white people. And the result were mulatto. So when we have mulatto parents who have twins, we have a 1 chance in a million that they will have different color. And we can imagine this can create quite interesting situation. So the 2 girls at school say, I'd like to introduce you to my sister. You tell me another joke. Yeah, really, she's my sister. Ah, I understand, she's adopted. No, she's my sister. But that is how genetics works. And they're perfectly sisters, genetically sisters. But it's beautiful to see how the genes work. And once you recreate the gene pool for all skin colors by taking black and white, then you can rebuild the possibility of any color, essentially. So I've been proposing to you in these 3 evenings that evolution has no solid framework. It doesn't have any solid scientific foundations. So what is the only logical alternative? Remember from the first night, we can exclude panspermia, which is life came from outer space. Because if abiogenesis can't happen on this planet, then it can't happen on another planet either. So the only logical alternative is that we are created by some kind of God. And I believe that this is the Christian God, the Bible. So I said to you yesterday that I was going to present today the biblical history of mankind, but with a genetic perspective. So according to the biblical story, God creates Adam and Eve. Then as we read on, we read that due to man's wickedness, God sends a flood to destroy the earth and all of mankind except Noah, his wife, the 3 sons, and their wives. So let's replay this genetically. When God created Adam and Eve, He created Adam and Eve genetically perfect. 0 mutations. Absolutely healthy genes. He also created Adam and Eve with a genome that contained all the genetic information for all the differences we see in all the people groups around the world. And I will use colors. So, as an example, so skin colors, Adam and Eve had all the possible genetic information to produce white and black skin color. I believe that they were probably somewhere in between, a nice, healthy brown color. What happens in those floods? From millions of people, we suddenly have a bottleneck, a dramatic reduction to 28 people. Not only do we have increasing number of mutations for every generation after Adam and Eve, and in the biblical story we read about sin. What is sin? Sin is essentially where man decided to not trust his God, disobeyed God, went against, thought he knew better than God, and we know from the biblical account that degeneration started. And this includes the degeneration of the human DNA. And so after every generation, the number of mutations continue to increase, and we suddenly, at the flood, have a dramatic reduction in the gene pool available to mankind. What happens after the flood? Okay, a little bit about the flood first. Yeah, but isn't the flood just a myth? It's just a legend, it's not real. Okay, if we just forget about the geology that confirms there was a global flood, the fact that we have so many fossils, we have entire cemeteries of dinosaurs, huge dinosaurs buried by some kind of catastrophe. We've got millions of fossils everywhere, and the conditions to form a fossil are incredibly rare, including the formation of fossils like jellyfish fossils, fossilization of soft tissue. These conditions are almost impossible to occur, and yet we find all these millions of fossils. The only way to really explain them and the majority of them that show watery burial, so some kind of catastrophe by water that caused them to be buried with sedimentation and water, etc. So apart from that, if we look at all the carbon deposits and the oil deposits that we have in the earth, then it's impossible for evolutionists to explain how come we have so many huge underground reservoirs of these materials, and yet it's absolutely feasible with the creation model. So apart from this, let's focus a little bit more on the human aspect. We have more than 500 cultures on the planet that all have some kind of a legend or some kind of a story that they tell about their history, which includes that a flood destroyed the earth, 8 people saved, a boat. And so to me, this is not coincidence. This means that there is something common to their history. And in fact, if we look, we find that these flood legends are found everywhere in the earth, from the Incas to the Chinese, to the Scandinavians, to the Aborigines. The entire earth is full of these stories, in my opinion, because it was a real historical event. So let's continue the genetic history of mankind. So after the flood, God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number and fill the earth." Did man do this? No. They decided to congregate into one large city, one large population. They decided to build this huge Tower of Babel in case God decided to send another flood, then they would be okay. And God was not happy. And at Babel, the people were free to marry each other. They were marrying whoever else was part of that population. And so genetically, the fact that they were free to intermarry means that the gene pool remained fairly constant. But every generation we have more and more mutations. Since they were all intermarrying, the likelihood of every now and then someone being born that's very light-skinned or someone very dark-skinned occurred occasionally, and the majority of them would have been more in between color. But the information was still there for white skin and black skin. But then, as I said, God wasn't happy with the situation, so he wanted man to fill the earth. So what does he do? He's very smart. He decided to create confusion by giving them different languages. Different languages create barriers. These barriers create division, and it starts migration of these groups of people with different languages away from Babel. And so a group of people who God gave the Chinese language to started moving towards what we now know as China. Because they became isolated from the bigger previous parental population, they started through natural selection losing some genetic information, like the genetic information for the capucine eye. Now the Chinese all have black, straight hair. You don't generally find blonde Chinese, and all the various other features through natural selection. And this way, they fulfilled the purpose that God had for mankind. And this allowed for natural selection to start in all the different people groups. And this is how we can explain the fact that we have the dark Africans, we have the so-called yellow Chinese, we've got the red Indians, the white Europeans, the black Aborigines, all descended from this big population in Babel. Now, man is always interested in different aspects of his history. So man wanted to study the origin of languages. And since they thought that we evolved according to the evolutionary tree, and the first night we saw that there is no evidence for that tree, as presented by even some evolutionist biologists, they proposed an evolutionary development of the languages according to a tree. So from the original common ancestor of some kind of animal grunts and noises, all the modern languages would have developed from these. Some of them have died, but we now have all these languages. So they went about to confirm that this was the case. But they were surprised once more. Surprised because they found that in reality, they didn't all descend from one common original language, but there are, depending on how you define them, between 8 and 20 original, completely distinct and different families of languages. In fact, it's not an evolutionary tree, but more an evolutionary orchard of the languages that they found. So we have the different modern languages, which are completely different to each other, but within these families there are languages that are similar, like Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, are a family language group. But they all seem to have a sudden start, which cannot be explained by the evolution model. There are some languages that have gone extinct, but languages change in time. Just like in Italian now, it's kind of cool to start using a whole bunch of English words in the Italian language. It's kind of sad because languages lose their original identity. But this is how these languages develop. But this kind of an orchard, like a number of fruit trees, exactly fits in with the creation model, where we have, at creation, Adam and Eve spoke the same language, otherwise we would have had the first divorce. Surely at the flood, Noah and his family spoke the same language. And then at Babel, God creates a confusion and creates these different languages. So once more, science seems to absolutely confirm the creationist model. Now, what is the oldest written language still in use today? This is Chinese. Chinese is a language based on a pictograph style. So in other words, the words kind of represent what the word means in a kind of picture form. Every word in Chinese is called the word that slips on mind, they'll come back to me. There's a different name for these characters. Radicals. They're called radicals. And each word is a radical, and when you add these together, you create new words. And these are some interesting words that I came across. This is an ancient form of Chinese, written Chinese. This is the word for forbidden, or to warn. This is made up of two radicals. The first one is the word for two trees. The second one is an abbreviated version of the word for God. If we look at read the Bible, we read of this garden, this very special garden called the Garden of Eden. In this garden, there were two very particular trees that were named. There was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and there was a tree of life. And God warned Adam and Eve, don't touch the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Otherwise, something very terrible will happen. Let's go to this next word. This is made up of three radicals. The first one is the word for vessel. So in English, this means like a container. Used for sea-going vessels. The second word is the word for eight, and the third one is the word for people. Again, going to the biblical record, we read about this vessel, this thing that went on in the sea, and there were 8 people on this vessel, and this is the word for boat. And it becomes more interesting. This is a very complicated word. This is the word for tempter. This is made up of many radicals, so we have secret plus man plus garden plus version of life. That gives us the word devil, okay, which is here. If we add to this devil the 2 additional words for 2 trees and cover, we have the word tempter. So according to the biblical account, the devil went and hid in one of these trees and secretly tried to go and tempt mankind. Isn't this incredible? How the Chinese language seems to have origin in the biblical account. Here's another word, to covet or to desire, to want something. This is made up of 2 radicals. Again, 2 trees, and you can see how this kind of looks like 2 trees. And women use the word for to covet or desire. Eve wanted, she desired the forbidden fruit. You can find this in a book called The Discovery of Genesis by C.H. Canyon. I was fascinated by this. And if we study the history of the Chinese race, we know that originally they were monotheistic. They worshipped one God. Now they're pantheistic, they're atheistic, and they're all sorts of other things. But originally, they served and worshipped one single God. And I believe that when this group of people who God gave the Chinese language migrated away from Babel, at some point they started realizing that their memories weren't so good anymore. And they said, we better start finding a way of recording our memories so that we don't lose our history. And when they developed their written language, they incorporated part of their history in their language. The biblical history of creation and the Garden of Eden. So, quick recap of the genetic story. So, Adam and Eve had a very large gene pool without a single genetic error when they were created. Then, after sin, they started to degenerate from a genetic level. So, man, because of sin, separates himself from God because he no longer wanted to trust God. And we have degeneration happening. So, every generation we have more degeneration of our genes through the mutations. And I would like to represent this the gene pool that we have and the genetic pool by these red chromosomes. Okay? And every generation, these genetic errors continue to accumulate, so we have more of these red chromosomes. And then suddenly at the flood, we have this bottleneck where we only have 8 people and we lose a lot of genetic information in our genome, and so represented by this diagram. And at this point, we can read in the Bible that to prevent the risk of genetic deformation, genetic problems, God strongly advised Moses not to marry a close relative. It wasn't our doctors that did this. It was God that gave us this instruction in the Bible many years ago. So now you have enough information to answer the following question. Who was Cain's wife? Most people know about the story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. But so who did he marry? Aha! There were other people. No, it's wrong. If we read the Bible, Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, we read, after Seth was born, okay, now we're ready, the third child, Seth, another man, we still got a problem. Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Aha! Adam and Eve had sons and daughters. According to Josephus, the Hebrew historian, based on the Jewish legends or stories that have been handed down, Adam and Eve only had 56 children. Now, maybe some ladies here might say to me, you're a man, you can say that Eve only had 56 children. You tried just having one. Now, I assisted my wife at the birth of both of our children. And for the birth of my first child, my daughter Celeste, my wife was in labor for 16 hours. At the end of it, I was exhausted. I was so tired. Okay, my wife was a little bit more tired than me, but it was hard work. And with my son, it was like a piece of cake. I prepared, I said, this time I'm ready. I packed my bag, and I had cereal bars, I had drinks, I had fruit, I had apples, bananas. I was ready to spend to camp the whole day in the hospital room. And when the nurse inspected my wife and said, they're already 5 centimeters dilated, your child will be out very soon. I said, I know that, I know my wife. I've got previous experience. My food here is already unprepared for a long stay here. Looking at 1 hour. My son was out. So anyway. But if you think that Eve, it doesn't say in the Bible how long Eve lived, but Adam lived over 900 years. Adam lived about 960 years. So I can imagine that Eve lived over 900 years as well. So why did she only have 56? Considering that she was likely physically nearly perfect. She would have been perfect before sin, but after sin, she started to degenerate. We have women now that have 20. Someone told me of an Indian lady that had 26 children, probably before she was 45 years old. So that's an interesting question. But anyway, so to answer the question, who was Cain's wife? A brother would have married a sister. Shock, horror! Why? Those glasses that we're wearing. In the beginning, there was no risk of genetic deformities. So it was absolutely okay genetically to marry your sister. Or your brother. So God creates Adam and Eve with perfect genes. We have sin come into the picture, and the genes start to degenerate. So we have increasing mutations with time. But in this period, marrying close relatives is normal. Whoever knows the biblical story, who did Abraham marry? Who? Sarah. Who was Sarah?
Sister.
Not sister, half sister. They had the same father, but different mothers. Did God bless their marriage? Oh yes. The people of God, the Hebrew people, according to the Bible, descend from Abraham. God said to Abraham, your descendants will be like the stars. You will not be able to count them. But then at some point, and we can read about this in Leviticus chapter 8, God said, now it's better for you not to marry a close relative. And today, it's probably advisable not even to marry a first or second cousin. You better go further out, otherwise there are more risks of genetic problems. So the Bible and the biblical model, the creation model, has always taught that we are one blood, the human race. But what happens if we have a distorted view of our origins? A view of our origins that is not according to the creation model. I would propose to you that the teaching of evolution, the theories of evolution, the ideas of evolution have added fuel to the fire of racism. I would like to say categorically that evolution is not the cause for racism, but it certainly fueled the fire. It added power to the fire of racism. Because evolution taught that some races were more evolved, and that means that some races were actually inferior and more like animals. At the time of Darwin, this was the thought. And what are some of the effects of this way of thinking? Well, Hitler, we know, was very strongly influenced by evolutionary concepts and by the science of eugenics. Eugenics was a science developed by Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin. It's all got to do with improving the race by selecting how the race develops and continues to evolve and reproduce. And we know that Hitler, between 1938 and 1945, exterminated 11 million people. We're not talking about soldiers who died in battle, we're talking about people that were considered to be inferior, who did not deserve to live, according to his perspective. Now, it is very little known that eugenics continued to survive until 1976, where forced sterilization happened to individuals in many modern civilized countries like the USA, like Sweden, Canada, and Norway, where people considered unfit to reproduce were prevented from being able to have children. Prevented also against their will, like multiple murderers, like mentally handicapped people and others. Evolution teaches us that we are just animals. So the value of life comes to nothing. And we can see the effects of this thinking with an event that happened in 1999 at the Columbine High School in the USA. These are two students from that high school, two very normal students who came from very well-to-do families. They weren't families from the Bronx or some other bad neighborhood. These were good families that they came from. And one day they go into their college armed with different weapons, and they start shooting the students and the teachers. And then they shot themselves. 15 people died that day. And the world was in shock. Newsweek magazine published this in the cover. Why did these normal boys go and kill 13 people before committing suicide? But their answer was actually fairly simple. That day, one of them had a t-shirt written "Natural Selection." They were clearly influenced by the evolutionary teaching of our origins, by the evolutionary teaching that there are inferior people on this planet who don't deserve to live. This is a picture of one of the girlfriends. She was shocked. She knew nothing about this. But unfortunately, we don't learn from history. A few years later, in a high school in Finland in 2007, another shooting. 9 people died. This young man left a video just before he went to his high school. In this video, he was wearing this t-shirt, "Humanity is overrated." In the video, he said, "It's time to put natural selection and survival of the fittest back on track." He also committed suicide after killing 8 people. And when we have a distorted view of our origins, then we enter into this moral relativism, where there is neither wrong nor right. There isn't good or bad. It all depends what glasses we are wearing. It all depends how we look at things. And so, whatever you want to do, if it feels good, just do it. You don't need to be accountable to a creator God. You don't need to answer to God about your behavior, because we're just animals. And we can just do what we want. And in the end, the evolution teaching teaches us that we don't need God. Our scientists, they are super bright, and they can explain and answer everything. Everything can be explained by science. We don't need God. And so evolution leads to the rejection of God. God, no thank you. Give me science. And so it leads to God being dead. And in fact, this teaching of evolution leads many Christian young people to leave the church when they go, especially when they go to university and beyond. So if we look at our society, what is the basis of our society today? I would like to propose that society was originally founded on the creation's position, and that was the Christian perspective, where God's word defines the absolutes. So here we can learn that there is a great value for every life, animal and human. In fact, the Bible teaches that Jesus Christ, the Son of God, died for every single human being. There is no human being that's more special or more valuable than any other. Every single human is special and of great worth. Here in the Christian principles, we read of absolute morality. It is clear what is good behavior, what is bad behavior. Here's where we learn about the institution of marriage. One man with one woman for life. Not this changing partners whenever we want, like changing when we want the latest model of car or the latest model of TV. And there are clear laws, clearly defined. This is right to do and this is wrong to do. So what happens if we start undermining these foundations? Like in this picture represented by these evolutionary turbines. If we start undermining, then the value of life diminishes. What does evolution teach? What are some of the effects of evolution teaching? Life has no value. If I need to survive, if I need to kill someone to survive, what's the big deal? Relative morality. Do what you want. Don't let anyone tell you that this is right and this is wrong. There is no right or wrong. Marriage, why marry? It kind of ties you up, it creates some problems. Be free, just live with whoever you want, and if you want to change model, just go to a different one. laws, the respect of laws disappears. And I would propose that this is some of the effects of the evolutionary teaching. And are we seeing these effects in society today? I'd say yes. Just in my lifetime, I'm seeing big changes in the society. So let's recap the two models. So the evolution model teaches us that through death and suffering and disease, we have the evolution of some kind of primitive creature to modern man. And we talked the first night about Haldane's expression, the cost of selection. The majority of any population has to die, must die, to permit the few individuals with the mutations that make them more adapted to an environment to become the dominant part of the population. Instead, the creationist model teaches that from man's decisions, from man's actions, we have introduced death and all the consequences of death and suffering and disease and all these other nasty things. So, if we look at these two positions, are they compatible? And I'd say that some Christians would say yes. Yes, they are compatible. The scientists teach us about millions of years and they give us all this evidence and they're absolutely sure of what they're presenting. But yet, I'm a Christian as well. I want to believe some of the Christian things about treating your neighbor nicely and those kind of things and loving each other. I don't agree with war and whatever else. But are these two positions really compatible? And there was a question about this last night. Personally, I don't think that they can be compatible because they are based on two very different principles. And if you start considering, as a Christian, the evolutionary side, then you're implying a lot of strange things. Some Christians believe in theistic evolution, where God uses evolution to produce man. Okay, so God's instrument, God's tool is evolution. But that would make God a pretty cruel God. If God uses suffering and disease to bring about the mutations and natural selection and all that kind of stuff. So God is a pretty mean and nasty God if God uses evolution. And some people think, well, there's just millions of years between Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and verse 2. And this explains all the fossils and so on. But again, it doesn't really make sense. Personally, I think the two aren't compatible. And let us look at a deeper level, more on a theological level. And so, if we say that, well, if God created Adam and Eve, okay, and Adam and Eve sinned, so what is sin? It's rebellion against God. It's not trusting God. And then sin is the result of, death is the result of sin, according to the Bible. But if I don't believe that God created man because we evolved, then what is sin? Well, it's some kind of philosophical idea. Okay, and who is this Jesus Christ, who the Bible says is the Son of God, who died for our sins? Hang on a minute, but if sin is a philosophical argument, then Jesus died for this philosophical argument. So Jesus was, he was a historical figure, he was a nice guy, but he was a foolish guy to die for a philosophical principle. And so from a believer's perspective, a Christian perspective, it starts to create some difficult questions in our minds about the compatibility between these two theories. And so if this is really true, that God didn't create mankind and sin is just a philosophical idea, and death has always been there because we have these fossils that are millions of years old, according to the evolutionary thinking. And we find fossils where we see dinosaur teeth planted in the fossil still. And we find dinosaur bones that have clearly got cancer of the bone, the same kind of cancer of the bone that we can have today. And so even the dinosaurs suffered of these diseases that we have today. And so we see disease and death and everything everywhere. So who is this Jesus Christ? And so what does that mean as Christians? Well, we might as well close the churches, sell our buildings, burn our Bibles, use them to light the fire or whatever. And this isn't really my thinking only. I'd like to challenge you on this thinking, and I'd like to finish off with one more slide. This is a slide that quotes an atheist, taken from an article in the American Atheist, which is an American paper, a technical paper. And the article is called Meaning of Evolution. This Richard Bosart writes, it becomes clear now that the whole justification of Jesus' life and his death is predicated on the existence of Adam and the forbidden fruit he and Eve ate. Without the original sin, who needs to be redeemed? Without Adam's fall into a life of constant sin, terminated by death, what purpose is there to Christianity? None. This is an atheist that wrote this. And it's interesting that in a seminar that I held a few years ago, it was the first or the second seminar, and this young man comes to me at the end of the seminar and starts talking to me, and from the way he was talking, I immediately understood that he was an atheist. He was probably about 21 or 22 years old, so a young guy, a young man. But he'd obviously read and thought deeply about stuff. And essentially what he said is, Christianity and the Bible and the Christianity and what the Bible teaches cannot be compatible with evolution. There are so many of these Christians who believe in evolution. It's just not compatible based on what the Bible says. And I had to say to him, you're absolutely right. And then I opened up the file and showed them this particular quote. So a young man, 21, 22 years old, came to this conclusion by himself. So this maybe for some Christians can be a challenging thought, a challenging subject. And I've had in previous presentations some Christians who challenged me on this particular way of thinking. But I don't want to debate it now. It's just to stimulate thought. So to conclude now, as I've done in the previous evenings, we need to weigh up the evidence. So tonight we studied about mitochondrial Eve, the Y chromosome, the origin of languages, hereditary morality, the origin of the flood legends. We studied also DNA, and I gave you the history of DNA according to a biblical perspective. And when we weigh these up, I'd like to propose to you tonight that the weight in favor of the creation model is much greater than the evolution model. Creationists don't have all the answers, and neither do the evolutionists. And as I mentioned, for the first half of my life, I was an evolutionist, but I loved science. And when I studied, I found some surprising information. And if I wanted to remain true to the scientific method, where I base my assumption, my conclusions on the evidence only, not on my preconceived assumptions that I got from where I was born or the school I went to, then I had to change my position. And that is what I did. And as I continue to study the subject, because it's fascinating, and as we have more discoveries by science, it's more and more reaffirming to me personally that the weight in favor of the creation model far exceeds the evolution model. And in fact, as presented in that DVD, these scientific evidences actually highlight some fatal flaws to the evolution model. And in that DVD, some PhD scientists, 15 different scientists of different specialist disciplines, all explain some of the topics that are presented and demonstrate in very high quality documentary film that evolution really has some serious problems. Which means the only real alternative is that we are the result of a creator God. So again, I'd like to open up the floor for questions on today's topic or any of the other subjects in this debate. So are there any questions?
Sorry. I come here late, but I have a lot of questions as usual.
You can start.
Okay. So because I can relate to my point, talk to me about how you define the concentration of the melanin, why people have a black skin or a Caucasian skin. And the question is, by the Bible, the first people was Adam and Eve. And I think the Garden of Eden, if I can say it like that, was made in the old city. No?
We don't know where the Garden of Eden was, because the flood destroyed the earth, and the flood's no longer anything. The earth is no longer recognizable compared to before the flood. But the Garden of Eden was this garden somewhere on the planet. We don't know where.
So, a lot of people say that maybe there is a possibility that we had in the past pre-Adamites, people before Adam and Eve. And I want to ask you if you think that this is reasonable. You think that had people before Adam and Eve. And my second question is about something that you showed in the slide that was about eugenia, kind of.
Eugenics?
Yes. I don't know if you heard about a history about Jakub.
No, I haven't.
Yes, Jakub basically is a guy that born in the old city, but this was very smart. Old city like Israel, Julian, Cisjordania, and he didn't like black people. And then he was very smart, and then he tried to make another kind of man. You guys can try to search this. It's a lot of document. Even scientists made kind of proof this, and basically took a lot of people who was no help with life in the whole city, and bring them to an island called Patmos. Today I don't know if the name is Patmos, and then he tried to create a special man with a little bit of more light skin. He tried this like maybe a lot of years, and then he creates the Caucasian man. And then they bring the Caucasian man to the old city, but supposedly the Caucasian man tried to have trouble, and they was out of the old city, and then they move out for Arabian, and yet we have Arabian today. So this is the document that I make my research, and I saw the article about Jakub, and I think 2 years ago, a scientist from University of US, they say that some of information of genetic of the Caucasian people is basically in the genetic of black people. I don't know what you think. I want to know your view on this.
Two good questions. The first one, the pre-Adamites. Well, when we look at the fossils, like this lady, this gentleman, we seem, according to the evolution dating, got humanoids before Adam and Eve, because the Bible says Adam and Eve lived like 6,500 years ago. So what about these who lived hundreds of or millions of years before Adam and Eve? So these must be the pre-Adamites. Or at some point, man becomes a pre-Adamite when he starts to become modern or evolved. Biblically, there is no basis for this. Okay? Biblically, you have Adam and Eve, and that is the start of the human race. There was nothing before. Actually, nothing before in this earth. Okay? Scientifically as well, based on part of the information that I've shown in these seminars and lots of other information, all the human ancestors that are presented by evolution can be classified either as human or as some kind of a monkey. Okay? There are no in-betweens. So Neanderthal is clearly human. Lucy is clearly some species of monkey that has got extinct. And you can do that for every single classification. In some cases, it's more difficult than others, because we do have lots of variety. The pygmy, and the aborigine, and the negroid, and the trapezoid, and all these different have different facial features and skulls and everything. And Neanderthal had a bigger head than modern man, so he had bigger brains. He should have been more intelligent than us, based on some thinking. And so, when we look at that, even from a fossil perspective, we cannot support the idea of the Adamites. And I believe the creation model or the biblical explanation of the origin of man fits very well with even the fossil data. So now to answer your other question, I've not heard about that particular theory of the origin of white and black people. I don't think we need to go to those extremes to explain black and white. Adam and Eve were given all the genetic information for white and black. They were probably a brownish color, in between color. And so quite often, populations of species have a potential for variation. And so you see like the little dog and the big dog, and the finch with the big beak and the finch with the little beak. And so they are designed in the genome to have variation in the species. And when the environment changes...
Sorry, I think it's better for you to show him those slides where you talk about the difference in genes, probably, because he went here, he wanted to say
because
that.
I was coming then also to the part of genes. So we have lots of variation between in any type of species. And when the conditions change, it's an opportunity for some of the more extreme limits of the species to be tested, putting it that way. They become expressed, like if there's a drought, the seed size changes, so the finch beak changes, to the point of having a new species of, but it's still a finch. Okay? And the same happens with humans and skin color. Now, the slide that I presented showed that the only thing that uniquely distinguishes a white man from a black man, or any other man on this planet, from a racial perspective, and we now know that races don't exist, but from the old way of thinking, is 6% of 0.2%, which is 0.012% of genetics, is different, uniquely different between the races. So genetically, we are the same. Genetically, the races don't exist. We are all one race. So we don't need to go into these extremes of finding some strange and weird and wonderful way to explain the origin of mankind. It's actually quite simple. Some of these pictures, these are the traditional way of seeing, thanks in part to Darwin. But if we go to further ahead, any two individuals on this earth only differ by 0.2% of their genetics. Everything else is common. Okay? And only 6% of this 0.2% distinguishes a black from a white, which is insignificant. So I hope that answers that question. Any other questions?
It's more of a comment. I think a lot about this issue. My field is medicine, and so life sciences. And I can't conceive that some people would come to certain conclusions based on morphology, either what we see here or even in microscopic morphology. I've been dealing with mental illnesses for the past, 15 years as a medical doctor, plus dealing with these more thinking processes. And I don't see much written into the evolution of thought, the evolution of concepts like love. If you think of the concept that, if you think of evolution, you need to think of everything that exists evolved. Everything. Even your own thoughts. Okay, it's easier to think of evolution of the nose, but evolution of thoughts, of feelings. And the evolution of love, and I speak about the evolution of love, I'm a romantic guy, but I see a lot of my patients go through tremendous challenges because of this issue. What is love? I have mothers continuing to be attached, emotionally attached to their children, even though the children may be murderers or beaten up. I see wives or girlfriends continue being attached to a certain person, even though they are beaten up. Which you may say, well, that's a pathological thought. Well, but if it is a thought, it had to evolve. It had to evolve. It didn't come just by spontaneous generation. Think about it. We cannot leave these aspects of the process of evolution. And now think about love. I've worked in situations where there was a very little food. And a mother or a father often left the best food for their children. Okay? Now, you might think, well, that is to allow for the survival of the species. Okay, but now that is a feeling. And sometimes it's more than a feeling, it's a thought. The mothers feel like eating that food. They are hungry. They feel like eating that food. But we don't. Because they want their child to feel better and to grow. Now, I've never seen anything written about the evolution of such concept. And it doesn't come just by spontaneous appearance. It had to, if evolution is correct, it had to evolve. But it evolves, and see, if evolution is correct, is the theory of something that really happened, then these concepts have to follow the same principles. Think of what self-sacrificial love does. I don't know if some parents here, I'm a parent, and you know, and so many things I do for my children, I don't feel like it. Where did that come from?
They come from you?
No. Where did it come from? What was the first thought of self-sacrificial love? How did it come? Genetically, because my thoughts are chemical processes. How did it come? Genetically. Against something that is the foundation of evolution, the survival of a genetic characteristic over another. See, if I'm going to exercise love according to my feelings of that concept of love, then I'm going to satisfy myself. But when I put my own interests aside for the sake of another being, where did that come from? It had to evolve. But that's against the very own foundation of evolution. See, you see that? It does not make sense. We cannot just look at morphology. We cannot just look at mitochondria. We cannot just look at Golgi apparatus. We cannot just look at that. We have to look at everything. Everything. Including the appearance of the elements. You know, one thing I hated was that table of chemical elements. I mean, you have to memorize that stuff. And okay, how did it come about? The elements. The elements. How did they come about? I have to go. I just wanted to leave this with you. And don't stop thinking. And don't stop thinking at one level only. Just go and go and go and you find this right. And thank you very much, Stephanie. And we can, guys, I would love to keep in touch with you. Just leave your emails. And can't we work out a deal where we can buy a few of these and just distribute them? If you're interested in these. She's got it. Can you, maybe in a piece of paper, if you can, and let me share the email with everyone. I would love to get some of these and maybe if somebody can't afford it, just I've not looked at it, but I hope it's good.
And we can extend that thought, for example, to music. How does music evolve? What benefit does it give to the reproduction of the human race? to the evolution of the human race. And altruism, the doctor talked about, okay, a mother willing to self-sacrifice for its child out of love. Okay, we can understand that. But what about someone giving their lives, dying to help somebody else who's a stranger? Altruism. You can't explain that through evolution. This is the opposite of it. I'm not preserving, I'm bringing an end to the species. Maybe I was genetically superior to the guy I've just saved. But I've just died because I've helped someone else. This altruism. How do you explain that through evolution? You just can't explain it through evolution.
Which is so funny. The two guys that killed people in the United States of America, 3 guys, they killed people because about the argument was natural selection. But why they killed themselves after they killed the people?
Okay, since they're dead, we can't actually speak to them, but we can assume that when they killed these people, the thought suddenly came to them. The implications of what they did suddenly came to them. And they realized, with blood everywhere, people screaming, and they said, we've killed these people, now what's going to happen? And they probably, I'm guessing, probably realized what they had done. And they said, they shot themselves because they couldn't face what they had just done. They were mixed up, very mixed up people, mixed up young men.
Thank you.
Here, I have a question now. I don't know exactly what it is, because when we talk about things like races are really difficult for me, they doesn't exist. Of course, but unfortunately, we still have people that think that.
Absolutely.
And the problem is that they think in a strong, really strong way that we have races and we must be separated by races. My question point is that I understand, I quite see when you said that probably evolutionists didn't create racism, but they carried a lot of fire, maybe, because we can find religious people that are racist. But how? Because if the Bible said that we are just one. For me, it's difficult to understand if, for example, those religious people, they are racist because of they were influenced by evolutionists, or if we can see racism as a sin, because we were created by God for those religious too, and humans try to disobey God. If we can see racism as a sin, as being disobedient with God, or if evolutionists really did create the racism, because when you present the theory of Darwin and other scientists that say that we evolved for animals, and then we have Africans, after Hispanic, and then Caucasian. So after Caucasian, yes, this is creating racism. So why we don't say that, yes, evolution is creating racism?
That's an interesting point. The Bible certainly does not teach racism. Okay? According to the Bible, all we can see is that this man Jesus Christ died for everybody. He didn't say, okay, I'm dying on the cross now, but you black guys forget it, or you white guys forget it. I didn't come for you guys. I just came for those guys over there. No, he came to die for everybody. Everybody that accepts Jesus' sacrifice for them, for their errors, for the things that are wrong in their life, will be saved without distinction. And so the Bible clearly does not teach. So when we have Christians that go around saying, those races are inferior, or those people are bad people, or whatever, that's not biblical. That's not Christian. Absolutely, it's not Christian. People go around killing in the name of God, or of Allah, or whatever. It's not Christian. That's not what the Bible teaches. Okay, so people who claim to be that are a bunch of hypocrites. They just put on a mask of Christianity and then take it off when they want to be themselves. It's not what Christians teach. But I still insist on saying that evolution did not cause racism. What caused racism? Racism is one of many, use the term, sins that man has. Racism is no different to lying or looking at someone else of my own race and saying he's inferior. Look, I've got a degree. He just sweeps the toilets in the school. He's just stupid and common. I'm far better and superior to him. I also look handsomer than he does. Okay? That's, you could classify as a sin as well. But that's not Christian behavior either. And so racism is just one of a line of many messed up thoughts that humankind has set up in his own brain as a result of sin, as a result of the degeneration of not only our physical bodies, our DNA, but the way we think. Because when we grew up in a country that, you know, the Muslims grow up and they say they hate the Jews. I went to boarding school with a Lebanese guy, and we had a Jewish guy. And that year we slept in the same dorm. There were like 7 of us in a big dorm. And so we had a Jew and a Muslim, and the Muslim guy kept saying, I hate you Jews, I will kill you Jews. Give me a gun and I will kill you Jews. Why? Because he grew up in this Muslim country where they said those Jews were going to kill them one day. Because that's what he's taught is normal. That's for him, that's not, he grows up that way. Same thing about food. You know, I don't insult anyone or whatever, but I've traveled to Korea. So it's all personal choices, but I've traveled to Korea for business, and I hated having to travel to Korea because of the food that they eat there. I'm a guy that just eats anything. I love food. I'm a vegetarian, but so not all food. Okay? I used to eat everything, but I don't anymore. But when I go to Korea, they have certain things, especially kimchi. Kimchi is rotten cabbage. And these Koreans just love kimchi. And I've tried it. I would try everything. But I can't stand it. It's horrible. But all the Koreans love this stuff. They love rotten stuff. They love rotten cabbage and rotten tomatoes and rotten whatever. And I say, how can these guys eat this rot? Again, it's what are we used to? To them, they say, what? You don't like kimchi? What's wrong with you? It's again, we grew up with these preconceived ideas, these glasses that we're hearing. This is what teaches us. So we grew up in a country where people are racist. So we become racist unless we decide to be individual and say, no, I'm not going to think like everybody else. This is wrong. But unfortunately, the majority of people like to follow the majority of people. And we have few individual thinkers. That's why we have racism.
It's just a comment, and I think you can help me, but I think the problem with racism, in my view, is like, I don't mind people call me a black man, or dark skinned man, or something else, but the problem with racism is, I think it's the base of a lot of bad feeling that we have. Hate, a lot of people was killed because racism. Imagine like when Spanish went to America, they killed a lot of native people. Look what I read something that I was crazy. Like English when they went to Australia, they killed
the Aborigines.
Yes,
to bring back their skulls to study the missing link.
Yes, it was stupid because they went to the community and give them room, a drink, then poison the room. While he was dancing with them, he was killing the whole community. So think about that. And the other part about racism that is very complicated is when it's become a kind of system. We call in Portuguese racism institutional. I can say institutional racism. When you have kind of behavior, even some of kind of, I don't, maybe it can be law that drive the society very,
Yes.
very racist. So I think the problem with racism is like this. Today, even in US, the relation between the cops and the black people in US. Why the black people?
Problems in St. Louis, for example. although they had the Civil War and they got over the Civil War and they said, no, blacks are the same as white, they have the same rights and everything else, there is still this prejudice.
Yes, and also Africa, we have a lot of problems. A lot of countries have problems with this, but the problem is that as long this go, like the institutional racism, the feeling of hating each other, superiority, and opportunities will be very, very bad. In some country, you can send your resume with your picture because you are black. You gotta think about this because a lot of people they tend to make a correlation between like racism and homosexual. But the problem is like this. I think both of them is bad and you sin, but with racism you can destroy life. You can make a guy that can have a job and also if I'm gonna have a hard time. And if you see this, don't make sense, but why, if it's a sin, and definitely is a sin throughout the history of mankind. That's the beginning. You have racism today, even with all type of campaign, movies, people is hating each other. You see some type of behavior. People don't like other people because the color, even they don't know the person. It's just see the person. I don't like this white guy. I don't like this black guy. You don't know them.
Yeah, sure. There's no excuse for racism. But if you just imagine you removed racism, we'd find something else to say they're worse than me. We'll find some other reason to hate other people. Because this is unfortunately other effects of sin. This is what happens when we believe we're just animals and we no longer feel that we need to answer to God for our behavior. Because when we recognize that we are all children of God and we have to answer to God for our behavior, then we will treat each other differently. Okay. To me, that is the answer. But while we think we're just animals like all the other animals, then we're going to have all sorts of these problems. There's no reason to think differently or behave differently according to the evolutionary model. There's no reason for it.
I have a question and comment. Probably, or do you think that when scientists were trying to find things, of course, sometimes they don't know exactly what they're going to find. And that's what I said yesterday, that sometimes some genius can say things that are wrong. And the problem is that sometimes when I said that probably evolutionists and science create racism, because I think my problem, my main problem wasn't exactly to find a guy that said that we were that we first had animals, then blacks, then Hispanic, and then Caucasians. The problem is that they took advantage